We are going to be up and down. It may be that I'll also get a lavalier in a moment, but this will give us some color, I think. We are very excited to be here today. I think what is going to be the differentiator for this talk is we're going to not just simply talk about content, but we're going to talk about the governance of content and what happens if you don't do that and what happens if you do. This is going to be both about how you do it and the strategy that you'll have to be developing. We have a bunch of really interesting case studies, and we're actually very excited about talking to you about them, and we want to hear yours. The rules of this game are interrupt whenever you can, because we want to make this as interactive as possible. If it turns out we are running out of time, we'll let you know. We want to stay around and hear your ideas and questions, but don't sit there and think you have to wait till the very end. If you're excited, get your hand up, okay? All right, so?
All right, well, we were hoping for 2 mics, so I get the body mic, so I get to move, and Kate, if she wants to talk, she's got to go back to the podium. So I'm going to kind of aim over here so we have split focus. But Kate, do you want to, we can start.
All right, let's do it. So just for starters, just a little bit about our background. So we love fuzzy things, but we really love metadata. With that, we had labels on our fuzzy things. So let's just talk with a little bit of kind of groundwork. What do you think it is actually costing us to have content bloat in our organizations? Anybody got any numbers that you can think of? Like, let's just think about it initially. How many hours per day does a typical worker in the US experience sort of mucking around with content? Anybody have a kind of guess? Yeah? An hour? Yeah? Give me a little more. 2 to 3. It's closer to 2, not quite 3. It's about 1 hour, 41 minutes per day that the average US worker spends mucking around with content. Mostly that's search, but you know it has a lot to do with finding actual documents and making sense of what kinds of risks lie therein. If I do just some very simple math, that's about 13.2 billion hours across all US workers annually, and it's about a $628 billion opportunity. I see somebody holding their hand. Oh, sorry, per week. What did I say, day? Yeah, it's just not quite 2 hours a day, but it is a week. So these are really substantial numbers, and the risks that lie within there are even bigger. So the risks that lie within there are things like privacy data, things like confidential information, things like redundant information that is causing us to make decisions erroneously because we don't have the latest and greatest. Sandy, do you want to talk anything about this? Because these are data that you pulled out.
Sure. So I'm just curious. This is my first time at the KM conference. How many of you are familiar with GDPR? Do you know what that is? Oh, fantastic. Okay. So these are the proposed fines from some of the first litigation against organizations under GDPR. And just again, I don't quite know how much you guys know. You don't have to be a European organization to be subject to GDPR. You just need to deal with European citizens, whether they're your staff, your customers, and potentially even, depending on what kind of content you have, a supplier. And so pretty much every organization is subject to GDPR, except in certain circumstances. And that is what some of these organizations, I think it's very funny that we are at a Marriott right now, are being nailed with. It's pretty severe. And by the way, this is per incident.
What do you expect for proposed time?
They're still being decided right now.
They're still in litigation.
That's what they're seeking as a fine. Yeah.
So we are going to be taking you a little bit on a journey, and there are many reasons for you to be caring about the content that lives underneath your roof or across your servers, across your organizations, and even in the custody of your partners.
So one of the things that I'm hoping to bring to the table today is a little bit of a legal information governance perspective. I am not an attorney myself, but I work with them all day long. And there are always kind of two ways to look at enterprise content. You can look at it as the asset that it is, which is I think what you guys do a lot of, but it's also a whopping liability on the other side. And so most of my work is involved in mitigating risk and exposure. And it's just a phenomenal reason to get control of your content and tag it, well, we'll get into this, tag it appropriately and make sure it's under control. So if you didn't know that, you have some friends in the legal department who have just as much, maybe more, of an incentive to get control of content. And these are some of the kind of legal risk areas, legal and cost risks. Just also so I know, you guys familiar with the term ROT, redundant, obsolete, trivial, AKA junk? Okay.
So we're going to take you first on a little bit of a learning process, and then we're going to come back to these 3 case studies. I want you guys to be aware of what we're coming up to, because there may be some familiarity. Start asking questions as we go along. We're going to talk to you about a large oil and gas manufacturer who had significant issues when they did an acquisition where they got a lot of content, a lot of IP, but not necessarily all of the brains to go with it. Many, many terabytes of information essential to the running of the business. The second one is a multi-store, multi-country fast food retailer where they had HR records and knowledge living in many, many different sites, some of which was inconsistent, some of which had privacy issues in it. Last but not least, we have a professional services firm, which I nicknamed the Information Hound, which is responsible for creating a bankruptcy data vault. So on behalf of lawyers and on behalf of banks, they were managing bankruptcy data for people who were in the bankruptcy filing process. This very sensitive data, many, many different formats, many, many different sources, a lot of tracking. So here's the groundwork for today. We're going to start with a little bit of kind of cerebral stuff, talking to you about metadata. A lot of you in the room live and breathe metadata every minute of every single day. We're going to put a little bit of a framework in place because that's going to then lead into some of the design process that we regularly undergo in order to design an auto classification scheme. And we've been talking a lot today about search that is very much around auto classification, and then with an overlay with cognitive services. Then we're going to dive right into the information governance lifecycle and how we make sure that we're on top of it, not only for avoiding risk, but also for finding opportunity. So I encourage you guys to start thinking about opportunities that emanate from knowing the knowledge that's inside there, possibly in some things that are revenue bearing in the future, like we find IP. So let's just start with the first place. Let's kind of frame everything up.
Want me to take it? All right, so I spend a lot of time over on the legal side explaining what metadata actually is, because most people with a legal or litigation background think that metadata is the red balloon, which is just essentially file metadata that you get from a system. And so the concept of what is metadata, by the way, if you need to explain this to folks in your organizations, there is a phenomenal video put out by the Australian National Archives of Australia. I can send a link if you're interested, just ping me. It's fantastic. It's called Metadata, and it's just fantastic. And so explaining that, no, there's a whole world of metadata available out there. Obviously, oh, yay, products that I work with, upwards of 600, 700 fields of metadata. So I know you guys really understand the value of that. Don't be put off by that. When software is creating or using metadata, it doesn't care whether there's 10 fields or 1,000 fields. It's the same. It's people who have to sit there and essentially do data entry where that is an issue. If we can get over the data entry aspect of it, then why not have extremely rich metadata? So these are examples of that. Some are kind of what I would call first order metadata. What is the effective date of the contract? And some are second order or derived metadata, like should this be under legal hold? Typical requirements for legal hold. Who's the custodian? What's the date range? What's the subject matter? There's 3 metadata fields. So these are all variations on a theme of what metadata is possible, and if this is possible, what would make sense for your organization? Generally, every organization is slightly different.
And another key kind of issue here is, as we're seeing that, a lot of those data don't come on a silver platter. There's a lot of work you need to do, even though it lives in the wild. You want to talk about this?
Sure. So again, sometimes when I'm trying to explain, metadata is not really a very new concept. Each of these is a version of metadata that people understand and are comfortable with. Barcodes are quite old. And I love the driver's license because it's just all metadata. The entire thing is metadata. And so once people understand, first of all, that these are examples of metadata that they can comprehend, and also the notion, I particularly like these two on the left, because what they are doing is separating where the metadata lives from the item in question. I'm sure this thing's got a barcode or something on it. So if you take your phone and you take the picture of the QR code, you are going to a website that has metadata about the product that you're looking at. That sort of separation of church and state is really helpful for people to understand that you can have essentially a metadata database or an abstracted notion of metadata that you can use to accomplish things. I'll take this one. So usually when I start talking about metadata and essentially adding structure, people will say, well, don't we have, structured data? And the answer is sort of. You guys know this, right? You sort of have it in your structured database. Thank God you have fields and field values. But all the unstructured data is kind of living at large. And then you have what I'll call the wizards or the forced data entry screens that you make people fill out in order to save a document, send a document, migrate a document. And generally what we find is that people will circumvent these at any cost. They'll just enter the A choice all the way down, so everything's about African aardvarks. Or they will say, same as last, no matter what. Anything they can do to essentially circumvent this so that what you wind up with is, one, a black market of metadata and really unreliable metadata. You guys know, I don't have to tell you what a nightmare that is. Generally over on the legal side or even IT or information governance groups don't really realize that there's good metadata and suspect metadata. And that's the number one way to get suspect metadata.
So we are really going to talk a lot about how rich metadata can be used in the information governance process.
Hi, Kate.
But did I just do that?
I think you popped on.
I popped on, so I wasn't on before that? Oh, all right, now I'm on. I can project. So what we're trying to talk about is basically knowing what documents you have in store, what the meaning is, what redundancy exists there, what kinds of risks you have, possibly a smoking gun, and also being able to protect it, being able to see what needs to be either disposed of, maintained, particularly in situations that are legally based. And no matter what, whenever you've been able to normalize your content through metadata, you're able to count it, you're able to sort it, you're able to do some stuff in terms of reporting. One of the biggest things that we notice here in the whole KM space is that there's very little counting. This is bringing you back to the counting. This is going to give you more and more opportunity to be able to translate everything that's underneath your roof into dollars and cents, which could be risk.
Okay, so part of what rich and reliable metadata brings you is context. And what we're going to show here is what's the difference between strong metadata or context around content versus search. Because if we take this phrase, wonder if anyone would mind if I curled up under this desk and took a nap. In this context, it's, aw, how cute. But in this context, not so great. Does this guy work for you? Do you know what he's doing while you're here at the conference? Okay. How about this one? Ooh, slightly uncomfortable. And then anybody fly here? okay? Search is going to give you all 4 of these as essentially identical because they're all going to hit on the phrase, but the context is completely different. You want to know who's speaking. That might be author or custodian or record holder, important facets of metadata. You might want to know who they're speaking to, a recipient, an audience. And you might want to know maybe the date or the circumstance in which that phrase was used. In a content management context, you might not want to know the document type, the record type, who authored it, how many times it was versioned. And is it the final version? Did someone sign off on it? You get the point.
So we've talked about, in praise of metadata, how it's ultimately going to be able to help us, and we will be talking those case studies. We've also talked about the liability of manual metadata, and we've also talked about the brilliance of context or the risk of not having context. Now we should talk a little bit about automation. This is an example of a coding of some unstructured data that I've started to do manually. And just starting this whole effort, I've been able to calculate about 84 hours worth of work just to start the coding process. Does anybody recognize this? So this is literally the transcript. This is the first of 84 pages of the transcript of Kennedy's meeting with his brother and with his advisors, primarily from the cabinet, around the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this was downloaded for the National Archives. And we OCR'd it, and then we started to do some tagging to go and see what kind of stuff we have going on. And in this case, I'm really interested in the types of dialogue going on. And boy, I'm really grateful that I've got Sandy here because doing this manually has been eye-opening. So this is in praise of auto-classification.
All right, so we're going to auto-classify a patent application. So that would be the document type, a patent application. How do we know that's a patent application? The same way you do. You use software algorithms, you use rules, you could use AI, machine learning typically. And there are probably 6 to 10 indicators that this is a patent application, chief among them the words patent application right up at the top. But there are lots and lots of clues that indicate the doc type. And doc type really is kind of the linchpin to this, because once you know the document type, you can think about what would I expect to find on that document type. So I'm going to expect to find an inventor on a patent application. I'm not going to expect to find a medical record number. Maybe, but unlikely. And so we're kind of playing with weightings in an algorithm of what's likely, what's not likely. And you can just keep clicking. And you can see the kind of extraction of metadata that you can produce here. Basically, anything in here is fair game if you can define it. And that's really going to be the role for the folks that understand content. I know there's also this taxonomy conference kind of co-resident with this. This is exactly the skill that's needed to drive these systems. The software can do this, but it needs to be told what. When do I want to look for a date and when not? When is a date highly relevant and when not? Or there's 16 dates in here. Which one should surpass the others in terms of a hierarchical approach? There's quite a strong element of analysis hierarchy that goes on here. In other words, here are 16 choices. Which is the best choice? If any of you watched IBM's Watson play Jeopardy, it's the same type of technique. I don't know if you remember that. It was a few years ago. But basically, Watson would evaluate answers and come up with the top 3 and then choose a top 1. What's really interesting is even when these systems make an error, and you saw this with Watson, the correct answer is in the other 2 choices. So you even have kind of strong errors, if you will, and consistent errors, which is really, you guys know this. You want your metadata to be consistent. Even if it's wrong, that's an easy fix. It's much harder to fix inconsistent, erroneous metadata. Oh, sorry, wait, go back for 1 second. So there were kind of 2 things at play here, and we're going to get to both of them. So far, we've been talking about tagging and classifying the content. That's what's orange in these pictures. The blue down at the bottom is that kind of derived state. We call that rules, and we're going to talk more about rules in a minute, so I won't spend too much time on it.
Fantastic. Thank you for that as well. So,
well, here we go.
So why don't we talk a little bit about this? Let's take a step deeper into auto classification and rules.
So the rules are really the thing that drive these are the 8 pillars of information governance. Okay, you recognize some of them, retention, rot, and so on. That should be rot. But basically, these are business objectives that are in play that can be handled with this type of automation. If you have the metadata, then it's just a question of structuring rules, which are really like if-then statements. So I'll give you a very simple kind of retention if-then statement. If it turns out the doc type is a contract, I'll do a finger every time I do a field, right? The doc type is a contract. The effective date is within 6 years, and the record type is whatever, personnel, then retain it. And then retention becomes a metadata tag. So you now have a tag for retention. Retention is usually record type, expiration date, and expiration handling. So it's expiring on June 15th. In what way? Is it being automatically deleted? Does it have to go through some workflow? Is it being sequestered for 6 months? What have you. So those are usually the components of retention. And each of those little components ultimately becomes a tag that you can use for knowledge management purposes. Okay, well, I kind of jumped it here, but basically you get the idea. So there's a retention rule sort of written out in what I kind of call codelish, sort of half code, half English. But the italics are the fielded metadata. This is, just to give you an example, I am sure, based on the smarts in this room, that you can handle this kind of thing. This is how you do rules. These are textually based rules. If you know how to do a regex, I'm impressed. If you don't, that's okay. You can just kind of mix and match, do word stemming, blah, 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 add lists of things. One of the nice things about an auto classification engine is that not only can it analyze the content of a document, it can analyze the content of what we call guidance data, like a retention schedule or a taxonomy or whatever the KM folks have written as this is how we organize or think. It can parse that too. So it can self-create rules, which is really spiffy. So here's the thing, you can just click. You guys can kind of see some of the, or if you have, here's an employee list, or it's querying your ERP. Here's an employee list. You can figure out employee tags, including who was in the organization on the date that the content was written. Okay, so now we get into a fun one, which is really hot lately, which is, yeah, go ahead.
If you have people that leave your organization, so if you have a video or you have a picture of that individual, it doesn't matter what term they left on, a lot of times you don't want that out there at all. So if you have a video that you created for training, for instance, the training department should try to go, and first of all, training metadata should be on that video, say, hey, John Smith left the company, you need to go ahead and redo this video and take John Smith's image out of there and put somebody else in. When you have this tagging on a document, no image is there, but a name is assigned to it. Name is important from a legal perspective because we may need to go back to John Smith and say, hey, John, you created a picture, but we're going to have to subpoena you for a legal issue. Hypothetically speaking, I don't know, I'm not a legal person. Is that true? Is that the case there where it's different for a document versus a video or a picture?
Probably not. It's probably, if what you're sort of describing is legal hold. If content is under legal hold, it's content. It could be a Word doc, a PowerPoint, a call recording. And one of the nice things about this type of technology, which is using a textual basis underneath, is that even video and audio can be made textual by using speech-to-text type software first. Same thing with foreign languages. So if you have content in Russian or Chinese, you can use an auto-translation engine and then either process in the native language or process in the English if that's beneficial for some reason. So usually the trick is get to text somehow. Sometimes there's also, like if it's, let's say it's a still photo, sometimes there's metadata that comes along with. So these are, if you have photos in your organization that are being taken with cell phones, you almost certainly you have latitude, longitude. Most people don't know that. Embedded in the photo, so you are actually tracking that person's whereabouts, or at least their whereabouts at the time that the photo was taken. That counts as personal data. Be careful. So what a lead-in into this. This is just an example of how to identify PII. You guys know what PII stands? Yeah, okay. So there's a couple different kinds of PII. There's the PII we know very well in this country, date of birth, social security number, that kind of thing. There's also what's considered personal data in the EU, which might be the fact that someone has a child or a spouse, which is not something we would normally think of in the US, but would constitute personal data. So the first thing you're looking for is PII or PD. And then the second thing you're looking for, we do have this in the United States, which is, this is a URL, which is a mortgage application. If you've ever tried to get a mortgage, you filled out one of these. And the fact that this, you may not be able to read it. It says title will be held in what names? And there are two names here, Brady and Wilma. And then there's a street address, which is the property address. So you can reasonably infer that they live or will live at that address. So those two items become PII based on their proximity tag and based on the document type, mortgage application. So there's that context story, right? Because it's a mortgage application, it's more likely that you can equate those two and make it PII. Very subtle there.
And then to conclude, the operation is probably going to be something like, this is active PII, so it will need protection. And to the extent that it moves, it needs to be redacted. So those are other data fields that get captured as part of the metadata. Whoops, I'm going forward here. So now let's talk a little bit about, once you have identified what your rules are, basically you know you're going to be doing a variety of different things under different conditions. How does this all work? What is actually the whole workflow? Why don't you do this one?
You want me to take it? All right. So there's kind of a couple steps that go on. There's a processing step, and it's usually called processing in place. So typically some sort of software agent is going to go out to the file share or the email server or what have you, and kind of run over the content. There are other techniques. There's cloud-based techniques. There's ingestion techniques. By and large, the winner is processing in place for obvious reasons. And what's going to happen is some sort of text extraction step. If the native text is there, it uses that. If not, it's going to run an OCR. You guys know what OCR is? Yeah. Okay. And get to text. If it's audio or video, it's going to do a speech to text. If it's in a foreign language, maybe, maybe not, translate to English. There's also sometimes things like, this is a folder, but this is the parent child, and the parent document, this is the child, the grandchild, and so on. That, if you're not familiar with that term, is called unitization. Unitization is essentially getting down to the unit document, preserving the kind of familial or attachment range. That's very important because you might have, the grandchild document might inform something important to the ultimate parent or grandparent or up and down the line. So you want to maintain those attachment ranges. So this is all kind of the setting up. And then once this is done, then that tagging step takes place, what I would call like essentially DNA sequencing or like a blood test. Get every piece of content or metadata that you're going to need out of that file, store it away, and then run it through what we call a disposition engine or a rules engine. What are all the things that you need to do with this content other than tag it? Do you need to assign a life cycle because it has a retention life cycle? Do you need to lock it down because there's sensitive data or privileged data in there? Do you need to put it into legal hold? Do you need to migrate it up to the cloud because this is that kind of content? And so on and so forth. So there's a lot of different actions that you can take, which is the disposition. And then ultimately, you're setting up for what we would call an evergreen perpetual state. And this is really setting you up for business transformation using AI to keep your content in control forever. This really isn't a one and done. A lot of people think like, oh, we'll just clean up the file share and then we're done. Yes, if no one ever wrote another email or received one, but it is a perpetual problem. We didn't put it in this, but if you're interested, of course, I have all of this. The kind of, I'm sure you know, the increasing rate at which we are creating and accumulating content. It is logarithmic in scale. So your yesterday's cleanup does not particularly help you tomorrow unless you have these perpetual systems in place. Question, comment?
So it might be implied in what you said here, but I wanted to call it out. Where do you see the sort of quality check happening? I mean, in those highly structured examples, it's somewhat straightforward from an authentication point of view, but when you get into the Wild West of content, reading that algorithm, you put a bunch of stuff in at first, it takes a while. How do you see that fitting into here and sort of the other range?
That is a great question. Thank you. So did you all hear the question? Yeah, okay. So there is absolutely a kind of a quality sanity check element to all of this. You do not want your software to just run amok. So there has to be somebody who's essentially in the role of subject matter expert that knows the organization's content and knows the organization's business practices. Because if you ask someone over here how they might tag content, and someone over there, they may come up with different answers. And so what we have found is usually there's somebody in the role of either knowledge management or information governance whose job it is to either know those answers or serve as the conduit to the various business units to get those answers. It's a critical, essential job in this. These systems, by the way, not only do they run perpetually, they usually iterate a few times until they are right. To answer the question explicitly, we generally see accuracy in the kind of 95 to 98% range. But that assumes there's human feedback. Okay, if it's just running on its own and taking its best shot, you're going to be more in the 85% range. So if that's good enough for you, great, let her rip. Generally, a little bit of human action. It's not a lot of work. It's usually some expert for maybe 10 hours total to pump it up to those much higher levels. It's usually well worth it. We would recommend that.
And it's also worth saying that these are not just cops. These are also people who are thinking deeply about opportunity. So it might very well be that somebody's being able to see that there's overlap in the IP in two different places. Maybe there's an opportunity for us to leverage content that's from the past. Ivan and I were talking about that a little bit earlier. There may be content that's, with Dennis we were talking about this, content that's 5 years old but is just invisible to the current staff. Or there might be something where we're discovering that there's a new procedure or process that could emerge based on something that went on in a similar organization. Much of it is invisible until we're able to use the metadata to overlay it. So do you want to talk about these sort of roughly?
Sure. So there's going to be a sequence of slides that show visually what you get when you start really tagging content with in an automated way. I mean, you could do this manually if you had an infinite army, but this is sort of what it looks like. This is data visualization, and this is sort of a typical data dashboard where each of the charts is going to represent some facet or some metadata tag that a system has pulled. So just to give you some examples, because I know it's very small, we have things like most frequent title, or government entity, or geographic location, or here's where we're getting really fancy, what type of illicit activity is being contemplated in the content. Again, those can be anything that are germane to your organization. The other thing that you get, I think we're going to get to this, we'll get to it in a couple slides, is what it looks like from a retention standpoint. But, oops, wait, go back up one.
Whoops.
You can also
Sorry.
do what Kate has called graph theory to me. I mean, you all maybe know what that is.
Knowledge graph.
But or knowledge graph, okay. Associations between types of content. So that could be people and topics, people to people. And you can both see like how present or how significant the topic is, as well as the intersection of topics. And then finally, you can, again, depending on the system, what you're seeing across the top is the tagged data. This has been done with software. And then sort of a preview image of the content itself, whatever it is that has fit the bill. So up at the top, we had a date range and domestic. And we pulled up, whatever. You can, obviously you can search, but there's a way to tag and literally just kind of click and drill down without having to structure a really fancy Boolean search. It's basically what you're doing, but with clicks. This is what retention looks like. So you have essentially how should it be handled, when should it be handled, and then kind of like detailed. And then now we get into that dispositioning. What should happen when it hits its due date? Should an email alert go out? Should it enter a new workflow, et cetera? So this is a really nice way to handle content lifecycle.
So I'm going to skip to our case studies,
Yep.
if you don't mind that. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about AI. I'm going to skip over these slides, but suffice to say that kind of the cutting edge is what I was hinting at before, is being able to not only be able to look at individual documents or individual content that's within the documents, but to also look at human interactions. So we're ingesting a lot of content that's in documents, but increasingly we're going to be using content that is coming from Yammer or is coming from Teams. And we're going to need to ask questions about things like what's coming out of brainwaves. I'm going to pass over this stuff because I really want to jump right into...
It's really cool. You should look at it. There's
Yeah.
a bunch of cool stuff.
Well, I'm going to jump right into these case studies. We talked about these before. This is just the same slide. But let's talk a little bit about this first one, Sandy.
Sure. So this is a multinational oil and gas concern. They have content in they have operations in 26 countries. They have content in 26 countries. They have 92,000 employees. Anybody fit that bill in here? And they basically grow by acquisition and the occasional divestiture. And when that happens, essentially what is happening from a content standpoint is that the content of another organization is being acquired, in many cases without the human beings who knew anything about it. And so what you have is, at least from sort of a legal or information governance perspective, is you have a real conundrum. Is any of this information potentially risky? And nobody seems to know what it is. In this case, it was a 200 terabyte drive. Here you go, Merry Christmas. And so, what's there? Is anything, should it be under legal hold? Because as part of an acquisition, you acquire the other organization's retention, you acquire their legal hold and their litigation obligations, any data privacy or lack thereof, and suddenly, boom, it's on you. So M&A, if you're looking for advocates for this type of thing, M&A is a huge one because everybody's so focused on the deal that they forget about once the deal is consummated, there's a huge kind of information nightmare that gets inherited. And that was the case with them. This one is a fast food organization that grew very quickly and still thinks that they're entrepreneurial and kind of, fun family-owned company, and they're in, I don't even know how many countries, I can't keep track, and realize that they have all kinds of data privacy issues, both in the US with CCPA, you guys know about CCPA in California, coming online January 1, and abroad. And so when you have organizations that have never really had any information governance, and you sit there and start with things like, I think we should migrate content. It opens up Pandora's box to, wait, what exactly are we doing with content? Where are we going? And they're in kind of a conundrum at the moment.
And they also were finding contract inconsistencies. So there were individual contracts for employees in different retail outlets, which are their restaurants, which were not 100% aligned, and nor was the language aligned. That put liability right out there. It was laid bare.
And then finally, I'm curious if any of you would identify this. This is what I would call a clearinghouse type of situation. In other words, purposely receiving content on a regular basis because it's a sort of data mining or data aggregating business. Some examples like that might be Zillow, right? Purposely aggregating data.
Yelp.
So Yelp, another one, exactly. Or any news feed type. What's the one? Huffington Post. So same idea here, except it was bankruptcy data. And so they are in the business of selling content analysis for a living. And so what they had been using and what many of them use is cheap manual labor in India or the Philippines, places where they speak English. Software is a complete game changer in situations like that. Starting to see it in insurance third-party administration, financial services. And so this is just a fabulous use case because it's using software to replace what was a pretty kind of mundane, low-level human data entry task.
And it was evergreen. So it was
And it's
able to take it
evergreen,
in.
right, it goes forever.
And this is our last slide. So these were some of the big lessons learned from these cases. I use the word lay bare, which is true. One of the things that happens when you're working with metadata, you have to know when to you kind of take the foot off of the pedal, because there is a lot of content, some of which is really going to be exposing the organization, and it needs a lot of care. This is a quote from Sandy herself. It's like walking around with your labels on the outside of your clothes. And then building the rules engine takes many, shall I say, multiples of how long you think it's going to take. It takes a lot longer because not only do you have to get everybody involved over it, but you learn and you realize there are more metadata than you ever thought. And then finally, if there was one bottom line that we're saying today, even though people like calling this document intelligence, it's really a lot more about information governance. This is much more about strategy than it is about super cool metadata attachment and analysis. So thank you. And we have room for a question?
We have 1 minute for one question.
Okay.
And I'm sure there's many more than that.
We're happy to hang out for a
Yeah,
bit
we're happy to
and
hang out.
answer questions.
Anybody else have a question? I think you have a question over
Can
there?
you go back one slide, please?
Yeah.
So a tool like this, you said with evergreen stuff, while the rules are written, like the rules you're talking about, everything, so that's all done, you know, SMEs, the legal department, and the knowledge management folks are all getting in the room, and then somebody signed off and those rules are finalized. How often do you go back and visit these rules to make sure that that stays fresh with legal changes? Again, the financial service industry changes all the time. A lot of these big industries, right? Big oil, all that stuff, the rules change all the time, especially when you get new leaders of a country, whether it's U.S. or otherwise. How do you go back and view? Is that part of your predictive governance plan?
Yes, and it's an excellent question because it is also absolutely part of the package. So the first thing is that the software should generally report on how accurate it thinks it is. So just because it thinks this is a hospital admission form, it has a certain amount of confidence in that. So it should be reporting back the confidence. And kind of like a piano can go out of tune over time, so can some of these things. And you can see that with the confidence reporting. Why does that happen? Regulations change, documents change. The way we speak about something or the way we design a document might change. Say again? Content can change, right. So there needs to be a certain amount of revisiting. Now the software is going to report itself, but a software is not going to know that a regulation change has happened. So that's where you want to have, essentially there's someone in the role of sort of sysadmin of this. It's sort of half technical, half information governance-y, who's kind of monitoring this and who's able to make a rules change on the fly if they need to. You can also set them to go backwards because sometimes you need to do that. And then there are also the more sophisticated systems can actually self-update. So there are subscription services that you can subscribe to that are, for example, tracking all the different data privacy legislation that's constantly coming out. In the US, we're going to have at least 50 different types. Puerto Rico, that will be 51. And so there are essentially, regulation aggregators that you can subscribe to. And so the software can also subscribe and sort of self-refer to make sure that it's accurate. Those are a bit more fancy, and they don't always apply, but everyone is aware, and you should be aware, that there is a kind of a vigilance that has to go on with this stuff.
Well, please join me in thanking Sandy and Katrina for
Thank you.